Okay, in this video, you're going to get a lot of information. There's a lot of terms that are going to be thrown at you, and for some of it's going to be overwhelming. But keep in mind, it's a workshop, and that really it's a class about trying to make films. It's about doing the discussion groups and doing all the assignments. And if some of this stuff flies over your head, it's okay. People study photography and cinema for years and years. So this is not something that you're probably going to get in one class. So don't get overwhelmed. Try to take in what you can. If you're using a cell phone, some of this doesn't apply, but it's so important to know how these cameras work and why we do certain things. So keep that in mind, and hopefully you'll enjoy this. Hey class, this is Tom Seymour with HUC 240. We're going to be going over some camera settings, how to use your camera, and we'll get into if you're using a cell phone as well, although that's a lot more basic for obvious reasons. So the first things we're going to talk about is ISO. ISO stands for International Standards Organization, and that's actually what set up what is known as film speeds. This goes back to when there was actual physical film, like 16 millimeter and 35 millimeter film, where it was about the sensitivity of the film that was manufactured. So if you were going to buy a film, let's say you bought 400 speed film, that's all you would be able to, you could not set the speed. You bought a certain speed. So for instance, when I shot my first 16 millimeter feature, we bought 400 speed, which was, believe it or not, was fast at the time. Now cameras have gone digital, but they've kept that sort of legacy. So film speeds can be ridiculously high now. So let's say 100 speed film would be not as sensitive to light. So you'd need a lot of light. So on a professional film shoot, you might see like 200 speed film, for instance, because they have a lot of lights. And what that is that type of film, if you use a lot of light, it will have very little grain. And this translates to the digital era, believe it or not. So for instance, if you were in a low light situation and you were using a digital camera, maybe normally you'd set your ISO to 800, but let's say there wasn't enough light, you might have to boost that up. Let's say you boost it up to 6400. Well, all of a sudden you start seeing this like digital grain, digital noise. That would be because you're kind of gaining up. You're forcing the sensor to take in what it can, so there's more grain and whatnot. So in general, I'm gonna show you like this screen, for instance. If you're gonna set up your camera, you could start with ISO of 800. It's a good place to start. So think of it in that way. I'm gonna show you these settings, and you could start with these settings and then you adjust from there depending on your situation. But the frame rate for your camera should be 24 frames. Shutter speed should be 1/50th. ISO 800. And then from there, the iris or the aperture is the hole in your camera that can get larger and smaller and let more light into the camera or less. Those have numbers of like f2, f2.8, f4, f5.6. So those are goes up all the way to f22, even more probably. So let's say f2 is a really wide open exposure, letting a lot of light. F22 would be a very small exposure, right? And we'll show you some of the videos for that in just a minute. So when you're setting up your camera, I recommend 24 frames a second. That emulates cinema. So it tends to have the feeling of a higher quality rather than something like 30 frames. 30 frames is really 29.97 frames, but we'll just call it 30 frames. and that has a feel more like reality TV or news, electronic media. 60 frames a second also has that sort of electronic feel. So 24 frames per second still is a sort of standard if you're trying to emulate cinema, unless you're doing slow motion, but that's different. Shutter speed, shutter speed is how long the individual frame is actually exposed for. These numbers, 1/25th, 1/50th. In general, it's like this. If you're shooting at 24 frames per second, your shutter speed wants to be about double that. So 1/50th, right? I mean, really it would be 1/48th, but 1/50th is pretty much what people are going to put on their camera if they're shooting at 24 frames a second. Once you go above that, what you start seeing is this is sort of a normal shutter, and you just notice the motion. As this moves faster, it starts getting a little more, the frame is actually clearer, which actually almost adds like a certain stutter, right? Sports is shot like this, high shutter speed. It's so like, let's say, this is Saving Private Ryan, for instance, but let's say someone was throwing a football game, a high shutter speed. If the camera panned, you'd see the football in detail. Low shutter speed, like 1/50th or below, it would look blurry versus sharp. But what happens is this slightly sort of stuttered look, right? You see this in Saving Private Ryan. They use faster shutter speeds often for fight scenes. It just makes action look a little faster. And a lot of this stuff is confusing, so what I really wanted to show you this. If you keep it to this, 24 frames a second, 1/50th shutter, start with ISO 800 unless you really don't have any light, and then you can boost that up. And then the iris is really the one you're going to be working with the most. For instance, this is my camera. This front roller is my iris. You're not going to be able to read these numbers, but if I roll this, the f-stops will change, and that's f5.6, f6.3, f7.1. This back roller here, and Canon has a similar setup. The back roller is then shutter speed, and these are more like whole numbers. And so you'll see 50, 100, 200. And then ISO, if you wanted to switch just that, it's like a button directly on the top of the camera. But if you're using a Canon camera, it's similar. There's going to be an ISO button, or it's in the menu. But beyond that, there is this thing called white balancing. So before you start shooting, we white balance the camera. So what does that mean? Well, you have to tell the camera what white is, because what it will then do is align all the colors correctly, and then so you'll get the best color quality. Now, a lot of cameras, cell phones probably have no control over the color temperature, which is fine. It's fine until you want to start adding multiple colors into a scene. Like if you wanted to add gels in, like if I wanted to be, I put a red gel on a light and my face wanted to be red and the background wanted to be blue, well then you'd have a serious problem if your camera automatically tried to white balance. What's it going to pick to white balance? And anyway, that it's things like that where you're really going to lose control of the situation depending on the phone you have. But that being said, I do think there are ways around that. You can probably lock your white balance on your cell phone, so that might be an option. Different color temperatures. We'll go into that really quick. Okay, so color temperature is measured in kelvins, which is it's a measurement of the hue of the light. So we can see on this chart some of the major ones you want to remember are tungsten, which is sort of indoor light. That's 3200 Kelvin. and then noon sunlight is 5600 Kelvin. Now, you can think of it as indoor light tends to be oranger or warmer, and outdoor light tends to be bluer. This varies wildly, right? If you could look at the low end, like embers in a fire, all the way up to 800K in the shade. But 3200 and 5600 are good to remember. They also talk about fluorescent light. So much of fluorescent light is daylight balanced now that would be more like 5600 kelvins. So now this is a reason. Let's say if you balanced for indoor lighting, and then walked outside, the footage would look really blue. If you white balanced outside and came inside, it would look really orange. Here's an example. This is an interesting example. The light that I'm using a little LED light. I have another one. This is what it looks like. I think this is probably like a $40 LED light. And it just, you can charge it. It plugs in. It's totally decent. Now, this only throws off daylight balanced light. But it comes with this little gel. And this gel balances it to 3200 Kelvin so that the light that it throws is not as blue. So anyway, that's why we need to white balance. So how do we white balance? Well, it varies a little bit from camera to camera. On this camera, it's pretty simple. I'd hit the button on top. There's, you can select basically a slot to adjust the white balance. Then I literally hit adjust the white, select white balance. I would take a white surface. On a Canon, you would actually take a still of it. You take a still of a white piece of paper under the light that you're trying to balance for. And you take a picture, and then you would then, in the menus under white balance, you would then use that as the picture as a sample.
How do we set the white balance on a T6i? They made it really simple. They still maintain the controls that are true to most of the Rebel and EOSs. Hit your white balance toggle. Right now it's set to the default auto white balance. But when you want to be more accurate, you can choose your daylight balance, shade, cloudy day, tungsten lighting, fluorescent lighting, strobe, and of course your custom white balance, which allows you to do a custom white balance setting and save it to your menu to get the correct exposure and color depending on the lighting situation.
This is the Panasonic GH4. I think the newest camera is the GH5, but this is a much simpler system where you'd hold the white out in front of the camera light, and then you would put that there, and then you would just hit set, and it would automatically align the light. If you were using colored gels, like you wanted to do something creative, what you'd actually have to do is white balance under your normal light and then add the gels after. Because think about it, if you added the gels first before you white balanced, the camera would take, let's say you put a white piece of paper in front of a red gel, it would take that sort of pink looking still you took and make it white, and then the gels wouldn't have that much effect. The thing is too, if you don't white balance and you go into post-production and the color is really off, you can readjust it, right? But what that will do is your image will take a beating. Because you didn't align the colors right, there's going to be slightly more noise. And then if you want to put additional color into it, color grading they call it, then that would become a problem. So if you work on a professional set, they're going to white balance. They're going to make sure that their ISO, their shutter speed, and the frame rate is all sort of set up the right way. Okay, so to end this thing off, we're going to watch a little video, and this goes into different kinds of lenses. For instance, this camera has a zoom lens, 14 to 42 meaning that it's a wide angle when it's fully zoomed out. And then if you zoom it in all the way to 42, then that's more like a medium lens. That's good for interviewing. And to have a lens like that, it means if you're on, let's say, in a medium shot, the background might be slightly blurred, versus if you tried to shoot that thing with the lens at 12 millimeters but then moved in, then everything would be in focus. And people really like that shallow depth of field.
Depth of field.
Now the easiest way to explain what depth of field is pretty much your zone of sharpness. Now that range can be changed. You can move it towards and away from your lens. You can make that range longer to get more things into focus, and you can make that range much shorter or shallower to get very minute details in focus while throwing everything else out of focus. The reason why depth of field is so important is because it allows you to literally guide your audience's eyes to different portions of the screen that you want them to pay attention to. Different depths of field can also evoke different types of emotions.
In this example, we have two people waving at each other, and both of them are in focus, and that is because we have a deep depth of field. Now in the second clip, nothing changes except for our depth of field. It's now more shallower, and our eyes are drawn to the person closer to the camera, since everything else behind him is out of focus. Now this changes the feel of the shot almost entirely, because now we see him much more separated from the other person in the scene, and this could mean some type of disconnection between the two characters. It also adds a little bit of mystery to the person in the background if we haven't introduced them yet. Now this is just one example of many, but you can start to see how depth of field is the opposite of coincidental, and it's very carefully planned out, and it can give a different tone and different feel to each one of your shots depending on how you use it.
Now there's three main elements that affect depth of field, and that is aperture, your focal length, and your subject distance to camera.
So at this point we understand how aperture affects depth of field. A large aperture, or a small f-stop number, will give you a more shallow depth of field, while a small aperture, or a large f-stop number, will give you a deeper depth of field. Now one thing that we haven't really talked about is how your focal length affects your depth of field. Now focal length is pretty much involved whenever you're swapping lenses out. So if you're going from a 50mm to a 100mm, you're changing your focal length. Whenever you're changing your focal length, the longer you set your focal length, the shallower your depth of field is going to be. So if I go from a 50mm lens to a 100mm lens, my depth of field is going to become much more shallower. And then finally, your subject distance to camera is very simple. The closer your subject is to camera, the shallower your depth of field becomes. By creatively manipulating these three elements to your advantage, you can evoke different emotions from your shots, making your visuals an element of the story. So to sum everything up, if you want to increase your depth of field, you need to narrow your aperture, so you need to pick a larger f-stop number. You can also move your subject further away from the camera, or you can shorten your focal length. And you can use a combination of all three to get an even deeper depth of field. But if you try to do the opposite, if you try to decrease your depth of field to make it more shallow, you want to widen your aperture, so you want to pick a smaller f-stop number. You want to move your subject closer to the camera, or you can increase your focal length.
This is a 52mm prime lens, and it's also it's a 1.4 lens. That's going to be even more confusing information, but that's basically the amount of light that the lens actually eats up. That's the amount of light that you lose when you use this light, but it's a fairly fast lens. And this is a cinema lens, so when you focus, the focus ring is very smooth, which means you can do focus pulls from foreground to background like you see in films. And also the iris is, you probably can't see this, but it's okay. The iris is unclicked, they call it. So you manually can open the iris from here, and it's smooth. Okay, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. But there is, you could talk about camera sensor sizes and how that affects the depth of field and a bunch of other things. But I feel like it's just too much information for an introductory class. I would say don't worry about this stuff, but just for your own information. So this camera, GH4, has a micro 4/3 sensor. So if you look through, that's a fairly small sensor. It's smaller than a full sensor camera, which is closer to a 35 millimeter sensor. And then the Canon cameras, this line, this is the TI series, actually has a slightly larger sensor than the Micro Four Thirds. It can affect a lens. If you buy a 12 millimeter lens for this camera, there's something like a 1.4 crop on it, so you're not truly getting 12 millimeters. You're getting something more like something closer to 20 or 18. I wouldn't worry about it too much. A lot of people like the big sensor cameras. Red cameras have big sensors. But these, the Micro Four Thirds ones are also very good. They're fully capable of 4K and all that stuff. And there are some advantages to having them. There's your lens will have less dimming at the edges. They say you'll actually get slightly more depth of field, which can be a good thing if you're hand-holding footage. There may be more in focus, but as you went over, there are other ways to achieve that. Let's finish this lesson up with watching a 4-minute video about lenses and depth of field. Again, I know this is a ton of information. Don't stress. Watch it and try to get what you can out of it.
What is aperture? Perhaps the most influential parameter of photography, aperture plays an important role in composition and setting up a shot. Let's take a closer look. Simply put, aperture is the hole in the lens through which light travels into the camera body and onto the camera sensor. To understand, let's look at the human eye. All cameras are designed like human eyes. The cornea of our eye is similar to the front element of the lens, gathering light and bending it inward toward the iris. The iris can expand or shrink, controlling the size of the pupil, which passes light into the inner eye. The pupil is what we refer to as the aperture in photography. The amount of light that falls onto the retina is determined by the size of the pupil. The larger the pupil, the more light falls onto the retina. The larger the aperture of the lens, the more light enters the camera. The iris of the lens controls the size of the aperture and is called the diaphragm. The diaphragm's function is to block all light with the exception of the light that goes through the aperture. In photography, aperture is expressed in f numbers, also known as f-stops. F-stops are a way of describing how open or closed the aperture is. The smaller the f-stop means a larger aperture, while a larger f-stop means a smaller aperture. This can be tricky to remember since large f-stops mean small aperture sizes. So an f-stop of f1.4 is larger than f2.8 and much larger than f8 or f11. Aside from controlling the amount of light passing through the lens and into the camera, the aperture has a direct impact on the depth of field, the area of the image that appears sharp. A large f number such as f16 will bring all foreground and background objects into focus, while a small f number such as f1.4 will isolate either the foreground or background objects and make everything else blurry. Every lens has a limit on how large or small the aperture can get. If you take a look at the specifications of your lens, it should indicate the maximum apertures, lowest f numbers, and minimum apertures, highest f numbers. The maximum aperture of the lens is much more important than the minimum aperture because it shows the speed of the lens. Lenses with apertures of f1.4 or f2.8 are considered fast lenses because they can pass more light into the camera than, for example, a lens with a maximum aperture of f4 or f5.6. That's the reason night photography usually requires fast lenses. The minimum aperture of a lens is usually not important and should rarely be used as diffraction will cause the image to lose clarity. It is also worth noting the two types of lenses, primes and zooms. Prime lenses have a fixed focal length, meaning they cannot zoom without physically moving closer or further away from the subject. Zoom lenses give you the flexibility for you to zoom in or out of an object while remaining stationary. While prime lenses will have a fixed maximum aperture, the maximum aperture of a zoom lens will often get smaller as the focal length increases. These lenses are called variable aperture lenses. This is important because for a zoom lens with a focal length of 70 to 200 millimeters, the aperture may increase from f3.5 to f5.6, decreasing the amount of light entering the camera. Because aperture controls the amount of light entering the camera, it also affects other parameters such as ISO and shutter speed. A larger aperture or smaller f number will let more light into the camera, allowing you to use a faster shutter speed or lower ISO value. This is beneficial to eliminate motion blur and reduce the amount of noise that your camera will produce if its ISO gets bumped up. Faster shutter speeds can be essential in scenes with lots of motion, like sports and wildlife photography. So a fast lens can help increase your shutter speed or decrease your ISO value if your shutter speed is set to a specific value. Fast lenses are also imperative for any kind of nighttime photography. Whether you're taking pictures of the Milky Way or doing a moonlit photo shoot, large apertures will let as much light in as possible. Small apertures can be useful as well. Shooting landscape scenes requires everything in crisp focus, so smaller apertures will sharpen any out-of-focus areas that may come about. To enable manual adjustment of aperture values, set your camera to either aperture priority or manual mode. Aperture priority will let you change aperture values manually while leaving shutter speed, most cameras, to the best realistic setting you can change on your camera, allowing for unique effects that can take your images to the next level.